Imagine quitting this completely safe, highly lucrative job, right? You walk away, you start a new company, and you quickly rack up like $8 million in debt.
Which is a complete nightmare scenario for anyone.
Right. But then you somehow turn around and build a billion-dollar global empire, and you do it using this massive, unpaid, decentralized labor force.
It is honestly one of the most incredible business stories out there.
Yeah, it really is. Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. Today, we're extracting the core strategies from a truly fascinating documentary-style account of one of the most unlikely triumphs of the century.
And you're going to love this because it's so much more than just a pop culture moment.
Exactly. We're looking at the incredible rise of BTS, the evolution of big hit entertainment into this powerhouse conglomerate called HYBE, and really the birth of what we now call the billion-dollar fandom economy.
Because to view this solely as a music story is, well, it's to miss the much larger picture here.
Oh, absolutely. Our mission for this deep dive is to figure out how a nearly bankrupt company completely inverted the traditional playbook and somehow built the biggest act on Earth.
What the source material reveals is a literal masterclass in grassroots community building. It's this structural case study in human psychology.
Yeah, recognizing the undeniable power of authenticity.
Right, and learning the actual mechanics of how to scale trust globally.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really appreciate the magnitude of what they pulled off, we have to start at the absolute bottom.
The very bottom, yeah. The founder of this whole enterprise, Bang Si-hyuk, was not some desperate amateur.
Right, he wasn't just throwing darts at a board hoping something would stick.
Exactly. He was already this highly successful hit-making songwriter and producer in the Korean music industry.
He was completely comfortable.
He was. I mean, he could have easily maintained his position, collecting substantial royalties.
Writing hits for the established legacy agencies that basically controlled the entire market.
But then the timeline shows this dramatic pivot. On February 1st, 2005, he just walks away from all that security to found his own independent company, Big Hit Entertainment.
Which is such a wild gamble. Think about how insane this is. It would be like a highly paid tech executive quitting a safe job at Google, right?
Yeah, a total leap of faith.
To go build experimental hardware in a damp garage with 7 unproven interns, all while drowning in personal debt. Because the strategy goes terribly for years.
It really did. The financial realities are grim. From the mid-2000s leading into the early 2010s, the company just struggled to gain any real traction.
Didn't he later admit they were on the verge of closing down?
He did, yeah. They were essentially done. The sources point to a reported debt of roughly 10 billion won.
Wow, 10 billion won.
Which translates to about 7 or 8 million US dollars.
That is, carrying that level of debt as a small independent agency.
Operating entirely outside the established ecosystem of the Korean Big Three entertainment companies. It's usually a death sentence.
Which brings us to the ultimate Hail Mary. On June 13th, 2013, they debut this 7-member group called BTS.
And these guys were total unknowns.
Right. Let's set the stage for you listening. Nobody in London or New York is waiting for these guys to drop a track. Even in Korea, they are massive underdogs.
Completely off the radar.
But instead of trying to copy the big agencies, they do something completely counterintuitive.
We really have to contrast their debut with the industry standard of that era to understand why it worked so well.
Because the traditional playbook was so rigid back then.
Exactly. It relied heavily on top-down, manufactured perfection. Artists were meticulously groomed, shielded from any controversy.
Presented as these flawless, untouchable idols.
Right. The mechanism was totally aspirational.
Yeah.
You look up to them because they were perfect.
But BTS goes the other way entirely. They were unusually open online, long before that was the corporate standard.
They were logging on and just talking to people.
Yeah, and they were shockingly honest about real anxieties. They're singing about the immense pressure of the school system, struggling with mental health, and just general crushing self-doubt.
And that decision to lead with vulnerability, it completely dismantled that traditional idol-to-fan hierarchy we just talked about.
Because they weren't untouchable stars anymore.
No, they positioned themselves as peers. They were communicating to their audience that they were navigating the exact same societal pressures.
The same internal struggles that, normal teenagers face every day.
Right. And the psychological mechanism at play here is that shared vulnerability accelerates trust.
It really does. And because they shared those raw vulnerabilities, they forged this radical bottom-up bond. But here's the thing.
Yeah.
If they're rejecting the traditional playbook and they literally don't have the massive marketing budgets of the big agencies, how do they actually reach anyone?
Well, the answer wasn't a marketing budget at all.
No, it was a structural shift in how fans operate,
Uh,
which directly created the fandom economy. We are talking about the birth of RM era.
The source material is quite explicit in how it defines this group. ARMY is not characterized merely as a fandom.
Or just a traditional audience, right?
They are described as a borderless small nation.
Okay, let me push back on this a little bit, because if you're listening to this, you might be thinking, aren't all super fans just really passionate?
I hear that a lot, yeah.
I mean, people camped out in the rain for Beatles tickets 50 years ago. People paint their faces for sports teams. What makes a fandom economy functionally different from just a bunch of people buying records and screaming at concerts?
What's fascinating here is the structural shift from passive consumption to active, organized, decentralized labor.
Active labor. Okay, explain that.
So in a traditional model, fans just consume the product the label markets to them, right? RY, on the other hand, functions as a highly sophisticated volunteer infrastructure.
So they aren't just buying the music.
Exactly. They operate as a global distribution network and a massive marketing department.
So they are actually replacing the corporate roles that Big Hit just couldn't afford to hire?
Precisely that. Take localization, for example.
Oh, this part is wild.
Right. In the traditional industry, if you want your content to reach South America or Europe, you hire a multinational localization team.
Which takes time and a ton of capital.
Capital they didn't have. So ARM built a real-time translation service.
Just on their own.
Entirely on their own. Within minutes of Big Hit releasing a video, these decentralized teams of fans have it subtitled into dozens of languages.
And doing it all for free. Just think about the algorithmic advantage of that.
It's massive.
If a video drops in Seoul, and 10 minutes later it is fully subtitled and accessible to teenagers in Brazil and France, the YouTube algorithm is going to catch fire.
It absolutely does. The mechanics of that coordination are what broke the ceiling for them.
They operate as a literal streaming army.
Yes, organizing strategically across time zones to push songs up charts. And they independently fund massive promotional projects like billboards in Times Square.
So these are not passive consumers at all.
No, they are decentralized corporate partners. This unpaid, highly motivated infrastructure is the specific mechanism that allowed a Korean language group to break into a Western market.
A market that had aggressively resisted non-English pop for decades, I might add.
Exactly. It's unprecedented.
It is wild. They basically crowdsourced a multinational corporation, and this grassroots engine is exactly what forced the traditional gatekeepers to finally pay attention.
The radio stations, the big media outlets that completely ignored them back in 2013.
Right. They had no choice but to look at the numbers,
Boy.
which leads to this massive scaling of their authenticity, because the bigger they get, the more they lean into that original message.
We see the real culmination of that narrative scaling on September 24th, 2018.
The UN speech.
Yes, BTS's leader, RM, is invited to speak at a UNICEF-linked youth event at the United Nations.
Which is huge.
The sources highlight this as a monumental milestone. They're widely reported as the first K-pop group to ever address the UN.
And they don't get up to the podium and pitch their new tour dates, you know?
Not at all.
The core message of that speech was plain and simple. It was just, love yourself, speak yourself.
The transition happening in that room is critical from a brand strategy perspective.
How so?
By taking the very same anxieties they sang about in 2013, the self-doubt, the societal pressure, and offering love yourself as a solution on a global humanitarian stage, they completely reframe themselves.
They aren't just a boy band anymore.
No, they are no longer simply a pop act. They're operating as a global youth movement.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because usually when an underground or niche act crosses over into absolute mainstream global dominance, they have to water themselves down.
Right, they compromise for radio play.
Exactly. But BTS hits the absolute peak without losing that core identity. Let's look at the timeline here. In August 2020, they released Dynamite.
Their first fully English single.
And on the September 5, 2020 chart date, Dynamite debuts at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100.
The absolute top of the mountain.
The first song by a South Korean act to ever achieve that. The impossible basically happened.
And hitting #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 is typically the ultimate top-down achievement.
Meaning the labels usually buy their way there, right?
Historically, yes. It required the backing of massive Western record labels relentless radio promotion, and fitting into a very specific sonic box dictated by industry gatekeepers.
But they didn't do any of that. It's like a completely independent, local indie film suddenly sweeping the Oscars,
Yeah.
winning Best Picture and Best Director, without ever abandoning the quirky, honest script that made its core fans love it in the first place.
That is a great way to look at it.
The fans basically brute forced the mainstream to accept them.
The mechanism of their Billboard success was entirely bottom-up. Because Big Hit had this borderless nation of active partners and army, they bypassed the radio gatekeepers entirely.
They didn't need them.
They didn't. The massive, organized streaming and purchasing power of the fandom forced the traditional charts to reflect their dominance.
So the mainstream had to adapt to BTS rather than BTS adapting to the mainstream?
Exactly. But this introduces a massive, complex problem for Big Hit Entertainment.
Oh, the monetization problem.
Right. If you are the executive sitting in Seoul, you have to figure out how to value and monetize this massive, borderless energy.
Because if I am an investor, how do I put a multiple on a movement? How do you take a decentralized fandom and turn it into a structured public company?
The strategic answer is that you have to build proprietary infrastructure.
You can't just live on Twitter and YouTube.
Exactly. If you rely entirely on third-party platforms, you are simply renting your audience. You are vulnerable to algorithm changes, and you are sharing the data and revenue with tech companies.
So in June 2019, Big Hit launched Weverse,
A dedicated fan community platform.
a platform built explicitly to own the fan relationship directly.
Yes, Weversers centralized communication, content distribution, and commerce all in one single place.
So no more middleman.
Right. By moving the fandom economy into an ecosystem they entirely controlled, Big Hit could capture the full financial value of the community's engagement.
And owning that data and that direct connection sets the stage for the corporate leap.
The IPO.
Yep. On October 15th, 2020, Big Hit Entertainment IPOs on the Korea Exchange. They finally go public.
And the numbers here are just fascinating to look at.
They really are. The stock is initially priced at 135,000 won. On opening day, the sheer enthusiasm from the market drives the price up to around double that.
Roughly 270,000 won.
But then in the following sessions, it falls sharply. It's a massive roller coaster.
The volatility of that IPO offers a very vivid lesson in how traditional markets view the fandom economy.
Because they don't quite get it, do they?
Not initially. You have this company generating massive real revenue, driven by unprecedented global enthusiasm. But when institutional investors look at the corporate structure, they see a glaring vulnerability.
So what does this all mean? I mean, I have to ask the pointed question here, especially if you're listening and you invest in the stock market. Is it fundamentally dangerous for a billion-dollar public conglomerate to have a valuation that swings so wildly on the fortunes, the health, and the public perception of just 7 guys?
It's a valid concern.
Because if you invest in a tech company, the software doesn't get exhausted, you know? If you invest in Disney, Mickey Mouse doesn't demand a break or get sick.
Right.
Relying on human capital like this seems like an incredibly terrifying amount of corporate risk.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the executive board at Big Hit was acutely aware of that exact risk.
They had to be.
The sharp drop following the IPO was a clear signal from the broader market regarding their single point of failure reliance on BTS.
Basically telling them, diversify or die.
Exactly.
Good.
To sustain a billion-dollar valuation, they had to decouple the company's worth from the daily output of those 7 individuals.
They needed a massive safety net.
Which explains their aggressive strategic moves over the next year. In 2021, Big Hit officially rebrands as HYBE.
Right.
And this wasn't merely a cosmetic name change. It was a structural signal to the market that they were transitioning from a single-band management agency into a diversified, multi-label music and tech platform conglomerate.
Right, because just a few months later, in April 2021, they make a move that completely stunned the industry.
The Ithaca Holdings acquisition.
Yeah, HYBE buys Scooter Braun's Ithaca Holdings for about $1 billion.
By acquiring Ithaca Holdings, HYBE planted a massive corporate flag in the American music business.
Overnight.
Literally overnight. More importantly, they instantly diversified their portfolio by bringing major established Western pop artists under their umbrella.
Justin Bieber, Ariana Grande, people like that.
Right. So the company that was $8 million in debt just a decade prior had used the capital generated by the grassroots fandom economy to buy traditional top-down industry power.
The absolute long shot had become the billion-dollar buyer.
It's poetry, really.
They bought the safety net. And it is incredible foresight that they did, because that massive corporate risk we just talked about, the reliance on those 7 guys, was about to be voluntarily triggered.
It was inevitable.
We are talking about the ultimate loyalty test.
The unique nature of their foundation was about to face a scenario that would just destroy almost any other entertainment entity.
On October 17th, 2022, right at the absolute peak of their global fame, HYBE announces that all 7 members of BTS will step away to fulfill South Korea's mandatory military service.
A huge moment.
And the eldest member, Jin, is the first to report on December 13th, 2022.
Evaluate the mechanics of this from a pure business perspective for a second.
Okay.
The #1 musical group in the world voluntarily presses pause on their collective output for years.
Let's use an analogy for the tech world again, right?
Sure.
This is exactly like Apple deciding to completely halt production of the iPhone, their best-selling flagship product, for 3 years.
Just pulling it off the shelves.
And banking entirely on the belief that their customers will simply wait and won't just jump to a competitor's shiny new smartphone in the meantime. In any normal industry, pressing pause at your absolute peak is corporate suicide.
It really is.
But in this case, the world simply agreed to wait.
This raises an important question. How does a publicly traded business survive this kind of deliberate, multi-year pause in their primary product?
How do they not just collapse?
The answer lies entirely in the psychological and structural foundation we discussed at the beginning of this deep dive.
The shared vulnerability.
Yes. The bottom-up bond, forged in 2013, built on that vulnerability rather than manufactured perfection, is the only reason a corporate entity could weather this storm.
Because if they were just manufactured idols, the fans would have gotten bored and moved on to the next shiny manufactured idol.
Exactly. The mechanism of their survival is that ARMY operates as invested partners in a shared movement.
They literally built the infrastructure.
Right. And when you are a partner in a movement, you don't abandon the partnership just because it enters a quiet phase.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
The loyalty isn't attached to a steady stream of catchy content. The loyalty is fundamentally attached to the shared narrative and the community itself.
They don't just consume the product, they are part of the very infrastructure that keeps the company alive.
Exactly.
It is truly unbelievable. So bringing this all together, what is the core takeaway from these sources? How did they pull this off?
By breaking all the rules.
Literally. BTS and HYBE won the biggest game in global entertainment by entirely inverting the old, established playbook.
The historical record they leave behind proves that radical honesty, constant direct connection, and treating your audience as active, structural partners will outscale manufactured, top-down entertainment every single time.
Every time.
They took a nearly bankrupt agency, and by harnessing the raw power of community, quite literally turned a fandom into a self-sustaining, multi-billion-dollar economy.
And for you listening right now, whether you are trying to build a startup business from scratch, whether you are trying to lead a corporate team, or you're just trying to figure out how to market a brand new idea, the story of Big Hit is the ultimate case study.
It really is the ultimate blueprint.
It proves that radical authenticity and investing deeply in your community yield infinitely better long-term dividends than presenting a glossy, unapproachable perfection.
Because when you empower people to see themselves in your struggles, and you provide them with the proprietary tools like Weverse to help build the solution alongside you, you're no longer just acquiring passive customers.
You're not just selling them something.
Right, you are building an ecosystem.
You're building a borderless nation, which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over as we wrap up today.
The big question.
Exactly. We've just spent this deep dive looking at how the founders of HYBE used platforms like Weverse to turn music fans into a highly organized, borderless economy. But what happens when this exact fandom economy blueprint is applied outside of pop music?
That is a terrifying and fascinating thought.
Right. If a political movement, a disruptive tech brand, or even a single CEO could build and mobilize their own global army operating with that same decentralized, unpaid labor force, how would that permanently disrupt our traditional power structure?
It would change everything.
It really would. Just imagine the lights flickering in that damp garage in 2005 with $8 million in debt, on the verge of turning off forever. The world had no idea that the blueprint to save that room would eventually rewrite the rules of global power.